зачат есть.
И во грехе ради мя, мать моя.
Себо истину возлюбил еси.
Известная и тайная премудрости Твоей явил Мессии.
Окропишь имя и сопом и очищуся.
Омыешь имя и паче снега убелюся.
Слуху моему даси радость и веселье.
Возрадуются кости смиренные.
Отврати лице Твое от грех моих.
И вся беззакония моя очисти.
Сердце чисто созижди во мне, Боже.
И дух прав обнови во утробе моей.
Не отвержи меня от лица Твоего.
И духа Твоего святого не отыми от меня.
Воздашь мне радость спасения Твоего.
И духом владычным утверди мя.
Научу беззаконные путем Твоим.
И нечестивые к Тебе обратятся.
Избави меня от крови, Боже, Боже, спасения моего.
Возрадуется язык мой правде Твоей.
Господи, устни мои отверзишь.
И уста моя возвестят хвалу Твою.
Яко аще бы восхотел и все жертвы дал бы губу.
Все сожжения не благоволишь.
Жертва Богу дух сокрушен.
Сердце сокрушенно и смиренно Бог не уничижит.
Ублажи, Господи, благоволением Твоим Сиона.
И да созиждутся стены Иерусалимские.
Когда благоволишь и жертву правды,
Возношение и все сожигаемое. Тогда возложат на алтарь Твой тельцы.
Помилуй мя, Боже, по велице милости Твоей.
И по множеству щедрот Твоих очисти беззаконие мое.
Наипаче омый мя от беззакония моего.
И от греха моего очисти мя.
Яко беззаконие мое знаю.
И грех мой предо мною есть вину.
Тебе единому согреши.
И лукавое пред Тобою сотвори.
Яко да оправдишься во слове всех Твоих.
И победишь, и в них да судите идти.
Себо беззаконие зачат
И
есть.
во грехе ради мя, мать моя.
Себо истину возлюбил еси.
Известная и тайная премудрости Твоей явил Мессии.
Окропишь имя и сопом и очищуся.
Омыешь имя и паче снега убелюся.
Слуху моему даси радость и веселье.
Возрадуются кости смиренные.
Отврати лице Твое от грех моих.
И вся беззакония моя очисти.
Сердце чисто созижди во мне, Боже.
И дух прав обнови во утробе моей.
Не отвержи меня от лица Твоего.
И духа Твоего святого не отыми от меня.
Воздашь мне радость спасения Твоего.
И духом владычным утверди мя.
Научу беззаконные путем Твоим.
И нечестивые к Тебе обратятся.
Избави меня от крови, Боже, Боже, спасения моего.
Возрадуется язык мой прав. сокрушенно и смиренно Бог не уничижит.
Ублажи, Господи, благоволением Твоим Сиона.
И да созиждутся стены Иерусалимские.
Когда благоволишь и жертву правды,
Возношение и все сожигаемое, тогда возложат на алтарь Твой тельцы.
помилуй мя, Боже, по велице ми.
And we are live. Hello. Can everyone hear me? I apologise, because I had this originally set for Saturday, but I had my first confession for 4.5 months, and it completely took it out of me. So I kind of had to relax a little bit, as I'm sure you can understand. So for those who are interested in the chant that was just put on there as the introduction to the stream, it is Psalm 50, chanted by the Brethren of the Valam Monastery in northern Russia, on the Finnish border, if I seem to remember correctly. So, as always, I have the Riot server open. If you want to place comments on there, it's at riot.renaissancemen.xyz. And I shall be taking questions from the chat, as always. This is going to be a little bit more of a Q&A stream. This isn't going to go on for quite as long, because the subject matter is pretty straightforward. But, of course, being your choice and being, of course, incredibly important, I thought it was important to go over this, which is, as the title of the stream should tell you, the state in life and how to determine what you ought to do. So, we're going to address this in two ways. I think it fits to do it in 2 ways, because I've got a rough plan, but it's not quite so detailed as with the other streams, so it's going to be a lot more freeform. First of all, we're going to be talking about the different vocations, which I'm sure you're all aware of if you're Catholic. For those who aren't aware of what a vocation is, it's essentially what you're going to do with your life in a broad categorical sense. So are you going to get married? Are you going to remain single, etc.? We're going to talk about this in very sparse detail, because frankly that's between you and God, and you have to discern your vocation through prayer, through charity, and through development of virtue. There's not really much I can add to that. But what the second part is going to entail is that we're going to be talking about the specific duties and rights of all Catholics involved in the church as a whole. So, specifically, what you must do and what rights are owed to you. We also, if there's time, if people want me to, I can go over traditional precepts of the church and penalties imposed by church law. So these are things that incur automatic excommunication. So if you want to follow along, I have 2 links in the description. I think I put them there on Saturday when I was supposed to do this. If not, I will stick them in there. Okay, I haven't stuck them in there. First of all, we have the lists of rights and responsibilities from Waterloo Catholics, which I will stick in there very briefly. If people want to refresh the page, they should see it about now. And the second one is going to be the Code of Canon Law, because the first page references the Canon Law quite extensively. So let's start with this. Also, if you haven't already, there is a poll on the communities page for this channel if you want to vote on the next stream. Currently, we are voting on 3 particular topics: mass migration, nationalism, and staying sane as a first one; against secular humanism and the quote scientific worldview, which is the second; and the third one, which is how to make intimate friendships with St. Aelred of Rievaulx, even, who was a 12th century Cistercian monk, which I find particularly interesting because I've been reading his book, Spiritual Friendship, very recently, and I think it's something that everyone here could benefit from. So if you want to vote on that and you haven't already, please go to the communities tab and do so. So first of all, let's talk about the different vocations. There is marriage, of course, there is the single life, which is remaining single and chaste, without any marriage, without any ordination, without joining any religious orders. There is the ordained life, which is becoming a priest or a bishop or even pope if you're so destined. And then there's the religious life, which are nuns, monks of various forms, various orders. And there's a lot of diversity in the different religious orders based on what sort of temperament that you have, although they ultimately follow the prescriptions of the Gospels known as the evangelical counsels. So we'll start with the one that most people here, I think it's something like 90% of people, are probably destined for, and that's marriage. And that consists of a man and a woman under the sacramental bond of marriage. And, I mean, there are so many different channels and so many different things covering how exactly to go about negotiating a marriage. And as someone who's never been married, you're probably best off checking those things. But the scriptures themselves have a lot on this particular thing. So, for example, the book of Sirach has a number of different passages about it, about what would be found in a good wife, what would be found in a bad one, etc. Likewise, the book of Proverbs, which is one of my favourite books of the Bible alongside Sirach. In fact, I love Sirach too. That has a lot of sayings on it, and it has a specifically very important passage for men, that being Proverbs 31, where in that chapter it describes what a perfect woman should do, and suffice to say, it doesn't consist in, well, the insanity of the feminism that we're seeing nowadays, of course, but it also doesn't consist in the 50s housewife. There's, of course, a balance, because both the kind of extremes that don't really work. But yeah, I'm gonna suggest that most of you here are going to be destined for marriage. So, for those who are unsure, I suppose I'll cover this now. Discerning vocation is something that takes a very, very long time. It takes years, and you're not going to know it immediately. You might have there are some people who know it pretty much immediately, and this is largely just due to your temperament, right? But it's something that you have to pray on quite a lot, and think about, not about what you want in this life, but in terms of what fits you best, what fits your temperament best and is conducive to your growth as a person. And I don't mean this in some sort of fluffy, very secular way of, well, how can I acquire the biggest gains in the gym? How can I acquire the biggest paycheck or whatever? Or even strictly virtue. Because if you read the documents of the Council of Trent, it is doctrine of the church that the celibate lives, the single life, the ordained life, and the religious life, specifically the religious one, I think is mentioned, these are preferable in terms of glory in heaven to married life. They're more conducive to it, and I think even St. Paul says as much in 1 Corinthians, because you have more time to focus on your spirituality, to focus on prayer, to focus on almsgiving. Because you see, when you give yourself to another person in marriage, you are necessarily going to be more tied up with serving your family as you're supposed to, and serving your wife and your children as you're supposed to, than if you were a single religious, where you'd be more able to dedicate yourself to acts of charity, to acts of prayer and things like that. And in fact, I think St. Paul even goes as far as to say is that if you're currently single, that you just keep on going. You don't. I mean, if you're meant for marriage, you're meant for marriage, and you'll know that. But you're supposed to continue along. I can't remember the exact citation. I think it's something like 1 Corinthians chapter 11 or something like that. But either way, most people here are going to be, of course, destined for marriage because that's what benefits most people spiritually. There's this misconception that it's the trad way of being that you get married to have children. Now, of course, that's one of the fruits of being married, but you really do it because the marriage itself provides you the ability to develop more spiritually. I mean, Mary and Joseph didn't have children together. That's an example of the Josephite marriages. It's far more fundamental than just have child, because what you see nowadays is that it's believed to be respectable that you'll get married for the sake of having children, and that alone is the primary aim. And that's a falsehood. Because the thing is that when the children are out of the picture, then why are you married? There's no reason to be married if it's not for the sake of the other person in some sense, or for the sake of growing in charity. So it doesn't build stable families because you build your marriage on the fact of having children, on the basis of having children. You have to do it for the sake of the other person. Yeah, the chat is rather dead. Okay, so let's go on further. Let's go on to the single life. So I'm assuming I'm in this state at the moment, and I think that most people here are as well, because I know that my audience... I'm not going to rely on the statistics on the page, because I don't think the analytics are right, but I think most of you are in your 20s and 30s, right? And that means that a large chunk of you are not going to be married. And I suppose this is effectively the default state. Children are in a single state. And, you know, there's no shame in staying in it. It's good. St. Paul says it's good, in fact. And it gives you a lot of time to work on yourself, which many of you are. That's why many of you came here in the first place. Because I set up this channel because I wanted to work on myself, and because I'm a kind of a book learning kind of person. It helps if I put that into words, that I learn it and that you learn it as well. So there's no shame in it. Just focus on keeping to the way of virtue, right, with single life, because there are many examples of this throughout basically reality. St. Ephraim the Syrian, in fact, was one, until he was ordained deacon. You have all manner of different hermits who were not ordained. I seem to recall St. Pachomius the Great was one. St. Anthony the Great, I don't believe, was ordained in any sense. I mean, every single saint that you've ever heard of, ever, has been in this state. And there's no shame in staying in it to the end if it's what's more conducive to your virtue, which is what you should be going for. By the way, the single most important virtue is charity. I don't emphasize this enough in streams. It's the love of Christ. That is the biggest one, and you should be basing your decision in these vocations on that. Thirdly, you have ordained life, which is to become a priest, or well, you may end up a bishop or whatever. This should not be made based on reputation in the community. This shouldn't be based on anything that is of this life, because a lot of people, at least in previous times, a lot of people would choose to be priests and bishops and even popes on the basis of material gain, and that's not what that is about. Being ordained is about a very strong desire to carry out the Mass and carry out the sacraments for the sake of the people of God. That's why you're ordained. You aren't ordained, or you shouldn't be an ordination if it's for a reason besides that. It shouldn't be selfish. It should be charitable, like all of these lives, right? I've said that it's for the sake of your spiritual growth, which it is, and the biggest virtue there is charity, and that involves sharing your time and everything of yourself with other people, as Christ did upon the cross, of course. So you of course, I'm not giving you much advice on this because frankly I haven't decided myself. I think I'm probably going to get married, but I don't know how it's going to go. But pray on it, and that's just a general description. Then you have religious life, which is fascinating because there are so many different orders and so many different configurations of how the religious work, right? Because in the Latin rites, ordained priests are always celibate. Well, they're almost always celibate, with some exceptions. Anglican ordinariate springs to mind. And religious life is very similar, but there are also additional things that different religious accept as a vow. So there are these vows are things that you must carry out, and that's part of being in the order. There are also different sets of rules that govern particular orders. The ones that are the most common are the rule of St. Augustine and the rule of St. Benedict. And these govern how either monasteries work in terms of cloistered religious, or how the different friars interact with their communities. So in the case of the Augustinians, and there's also the Dominicans who have the Dominican Constitution, which governs how they're supposed to behave. But generally, you have 3 different vows. You have the vow of chastity, which is where you don't have conjugal relations, you don't get married. You have the second one, which is obedience, which is you obey your superior in the order. So, for example, in a Benedictine abbey, this would consist in obeying the abbot. Thirdly, you have poverty, which regular priests don't have, but religious have it in the sense they're supposed to retain a certain simplicity. I can't remember the specifics of it. It's basically not owning, I think it's something like not owning land, but in essence, you try to keep your material presence to as little of an extent as possible. This is most expressed in orders like the Franciscans. And then there are other ones for other people. So, for example, the Jesuits, they have a vow where they swear obedience to the Pope explicitly. They are the Pope's men, in a very literal sense. And other orders like the Dominicans, in fact, the Dominicans are quite notable for this. I'm thinking of Savonarola specifically, and the Franciscans don't have that. So I personally think, because marriage and the ordained life inside the Canons Regular is pretty straightforward, the religious life is probably the most varied, because on one hand you have monks like the Carthusians, who behave in an arguably more extreme way than the monks of Egypt. Because what the Carthusians will do is that they only have something like half an hour a day of actual conversation, and the rest of the time they will spend on their own. They will pray on their own, I believe. They have their own psalters, and they spend all of their time in prayer, usually just locked in a room. I've heard that some of them have their own gardens as well, separately. That might be a specific branch of that. But on the other hand, you have others like Franciscans and Dominicans who are out in the community doing all sorts of things. In fact, for the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and also the Jesuits, are known for producing a lot of very, very good teachers. Lots of people with doctoral degrees, highly educated people. And although in the beginning the Franciscans were very much manual labourers, you have the Benedictines and the different groups related to them, so the Cistercians, the Trappists, and all manner of other breakaway groups of cloistered monks under the Benedictine rule, and under variations on that, which are primarily dedicated to the principle of ora et labora, or prayer and work. So they'd keep certain prayer hours, which have changed since St. Benedict came up with the rule at the beginning of the 6th century. But they still keep the prayer, and they also do things like plant fields and manufacture things. In fact, I mentioned at the beginning of the stream a particular Cistercian abbot called St. Aelred of Rievaulx. I'm trying to pronounce it because it's a strange spelling. It's not spelt how French towns normally called, but this is actually in Yorkshire. So it's kind of hard to pronounce because there's a ULX as opposed to a UX, as you'd expect for Rievaulx. But these monks up in Rievaulx, I'll call it that, in Yorkshire, they used to smelt iron. Likewise, the Trappists are known for their beer. There's a lot of different monasteries that will do things like produce honey, produce beer. In fact, the oldest brewery in the world in Bavaria is an abbey. So they're focused largely on, economic productive activities. Of course they do other things, but that's one of the main focuses of the Benedictine orders. Okay, so I'm just going to see briefly if there are any questions before I get on to the second part. Because I saw some at the corner of my eye. So, David H., is Mary literally the mother of God, or God's surrogate mother? Mary is literally the mother of God. She gave birth to the body and flesh, well, the flesh and blood of Christ, the human nature of Christ. Although God himself sustains the soul and divinity of Christ, because God produces all souls of all human beings, and of course the divinity comes from Christ's divine essence. His being God, in other words. But the Immaculate Conception means that Christ isn't biologically related to Christ. No. No, not at all. Let's see. I mean, you've got to remember Mary's sinless as well. The Immaculate Conception, after all. Let's see. Why are the Jesuits some of the worst heretics? Checkmate. Well, I mean, they are the largest order as well. That is something that often people forget, right? The Jesuits are the largest order to the best of my knowledge. There are some orders of religious sisters that are also very large as well, but some of the ones you see a lot on YouTube, like the Dominicans and Franciscans, aren't nearly as big as you'd think. The Jesuits are really, really big, actually. Also, is it ungodly to get married by the Catholic Church but not sign a legal state marriage contract? Well, I don't think it affects the sacrament at all, so don't worry about that. It might be illegal, but then you'd be... I don't know, it depends on your country. I was thinking of sending a letter to the nearby Carthusian monastery to ask them to pray for the conversion of my friend. They can receive letters, right? I assume so, I don't know, though. So anyway, after that brief interlude, let's move on to the duties of all Catholics. And this is from the website, Waterloo Catholics, which I put in the description. If you can't see it in the description, you need to refresh the page. So we'll go through rights and through the duties that we have, our responsibilities, and also the rights that we have. Okay. So first of all, unless there's any other questions that I've missed. There we go. Okay. First duty that we have, to maintain communion with the Church and to fulfill our Christian duties. Of course, if you schism from the Church, that is, knowing that the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of Christ, you go for another church. Say, become a Protestant, or say, become an Eastern Orthodox. You'd be in schism. At the very least, if you went for a Protestant denomination, you'd probably be in heresy as well. So yeah, you have to do that, otherwise that's pain of mortal sin. You're separating yourself from the body of Christ. 2. To seek the truth about God and the Church, to embrace the truth and keep it. So, of course, it's important to know who Christ actually was. It's important to know why he's important. It's important to know the history of the Church. That's something that we should do to the best of our ability. Now, of course, that differs by person, right? You're not going to go to hell if you have Down syndrome, so you can't learn as effectively as other people. That's not going to be something that happens. But if you are somebody who is able to sit and read and work, you have a certain expectation to know what's going on with the Church in its particular rules. You should have an idea of the history, even if it's just for the sake of keeping the parish in order. Because parishes have histories as well, especially if you're in Europe. Sometimes they go back hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years. You have a certain responsibility to know that, as well as, of course, to know orthodoxy. So, for example, you see a lot of people meddling in, say, I don't know, is Francis a legitimate pope, right? Now, that is something that is to be discussed, to the best of my understanding, by cardinals and not anybody watching this, unless you're a cardinal. So don't worry about it. Just stay under Pope. Just stay under the Pope. Because if you apostatize and go full sede, then you are essentially in schism. I mean, you are in schism, at the very least, if not in outright heresy. So don't play around with that kind of thing. 3. To obey church authority. Now, let me make this very clear, because there's canon law citations for all of these, if you need clarity, and this is something that I know that people in my audience are going to want, so I'm going to read out the canon law as well, because this is important to get clarity on this particular issue, because I know that some people are of the more recognise and resist types, which I personally don't understand. I mean, there's so many different things that you could be reading on church doctrine. I don't see why you'd have to panic so much about whatever's going on, but hey ho. Canon 212, this is specifically. Conscious of their own responsibility, the Christian faithful are bound to follow with Christian obedience those things which the sacred pastors, inasmuch as they represent Christ, declare as teachers of the faith or establish as rulers of the church. So in other words, if you have a bishop that, say, teaches that there are 12 aeons under with the demiurge included, you're not obliged to follow them. However, if they're teaching something that is really obviously orthodox, you are. And if it's ambiguous, you should probably side on the side of charity, because frankly, so few people actually know what's going on with the teachings, and I include myself in that who are we to go and contradict the representative of Christ in our particular area? Because that's what the bishop is, and likewise the priests under him are as well. St. Francis of Assisi, who was from a time where the priests simply weren't as well educated as they are now. Don't forget that seminaries, like priests will spend 6 years in a seminary. He said, if an angel and a bishop stood before me, I'd bow towards the bishop first, and that's because the priest. He says specifically the priest. The priest is ordained, and so he can act in persona Christi, and so that's why he bowed to the priest before the angel. It's a matter of hierarchy. Let's see if there are any particularly spicy comments after that one. Okay, so let's continue. To express to church authorities our viewpoints on matters which affect the church. Which is again from the same canon, code of canon law, or a particular statute. So yeah, if you're worried about something that could cause serious problems in the parish, you have to express it, right? If you see, one of the examples, right, if you were in the ordained life, if you were a Benedictine, there are very strong rules in the Benedictine rule against the forming of factions inside of the monastery, because that's how there is disunity within monasteries. Often there will be a formation of a particular faction of different monks, say 3 of them out of 12 form a particular group, and they act as a block against the other 9. You want to avoid that, and if you see something like that happening, it disrupts the unity of the parish, and you should air it to the priest, and if necessary to the bishop. So you should do that. And that's even if it causes you a great deal of pain, because the sustaining of the community is more important than your own life. Because there's one of you and there's many of them. Next one. To lead a holy life. So be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, to the greatest extent that you can. Follow Christ in all things, and follow his will from moment to moment. That's what a holy life is, according to the Self-Abandonment to Divine Providence, and to many other books. It consists entirely in following God's will. It doesn't mean saying the entire office, or even 2 offices. It doesn't mean going arbitrarily out and doing all of the acts of mercy, burying the dead, weeping with widows, going and visiting prisoners in prison. Although these are manifestations of that will, and they're good things, doing these things alone is not what you're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is sacrifice your will to God, and that's what a holy life is to will what God wills. 6. To assist at Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, to abstain from work or business that inhibits worship, celebration or relaxation on those days. So you're not supposed to work on Sundays, and you're supposed to go to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, and not work on them as well. Now, this is often something that's kind of ambiguous, but from what I remember from the canon law, we'll actually check while we're here because I have it open. It's Canon 1247. If I remember correctly, I'll check. But you're supposed to abstain from what is known as servile work, which is work that places more emphasis on your mind, your body than your mind. So, for example, digging holes and stuff. And honestly, I think it goes against the spirit of day of rest to program for 10 hours that day as well, or to do something on the computer like that. So I avoid that as well myself, and I wouldn't want to take a chance. 7. To take an active part in the celebration of Mass and to receive communion frequently. Yes. You have to do that. If you're of course confirmed. Obviously, if you're not confirmed or you're in mortal sin, obviously don't receive communion. That's sacrilege. But if you are of that state where you are confirmed, which most Catholics are, then do that. Number 8. To receive communion at least once a year during the Easter season. Pretty straightforward. Number 9. To abstain from food and drink other than water 1 hour before receiving communion. That is Canon 919. It used to be longer, but you have to remember that the canon laws, because a lot of people will use, say, the Code of Canon Law from 1917 to attack the current practices of the Church. The canon laws in themselves are not infallible. They are part of the magisterium, but they're part of a fallible part of magisterium if they reflect discipline. If they reflect doctrine, it is infallible. So, for example, leading a holy life, that's something that you're supposed to do, that's infallible. To maintain communion with the Church, that's infallible. But to abstain from food other than water for 1 hour before receiving communion, that is fallible. But you're supposed to do it right now because that's the current discipline. Because before 1963, when Saint Pope Paul VI changed the fast, it was the whole day before. You were supposed to fast all of Sunday until you had communion, if I recall correctly. Or it may have even been the full day before, including Saturday. I can't remember especially, but that's an example of discipline. So if you see people citing, say, the Code of Canon Law in 1917 trying to demolish current disciplines in the Church, it's not a valid argument. Number 10. To refrain from receiving communion under the penalty of excommunication, interdict, or grave sin. We've just covered this. Number 11. To make an individual and complete confession of all grave sins unless physical or morally unable to do so. I don't. It doesn't actually say this here, but I think you're supposed to do this once a year. Although you're not going to get that far if you only do it once a year. You should do it more often, insofar as you're not scrupulous. Number 12. To confess grave sins by kind and number at least once a year. So that's continuing on from this. Yeah, by the way, if you die in a state of grave sin, or mortal sin, there's a 1 in 100,000 chance that you'll get to heaven, according to St. Jerome. So, yeah, go confession. I'm going to quickly check the chat here, because I know that there's people talking in the chat while I'm talking about this. I'll answer the stuff about Kanye after I've gone through the canons here. If you've got any questions here which are directly related to the canon law, tag me. If they're not, don't tag me, and I'll come back to them when we do the question and answer segment, aside from all of this. Okay. Number 13, to be confirmed at the proper time, which comes from Canon 890. I'm not actually sure what this means myself, so I'm going to go look it up. Canon 90. 890 even. The faithful are obliged to receive this sacrament at the proper time. Parents and pastors of souls, especially pastors of parishes, are to take care that the faithful are properly instructed to receive the sacrament and come at it at the appropriate time. So there's leeway. I suppose there always has to be, because human beings are very different. One person might be ready very quickly, another person may take years. God's providence will often ensure such things as well, as I can tell you from personal experience. 14. To be married in the presence of a priest or a layperson designated by the bishop and 2 witnesses. So if you're going to get married, you have to get married under those circumstances. None of this registry office stuff alone. That's not a valid marriage. Not a sacramental one, certainly. Number 15. To do penance and observe special days of penance established by the Church, such as Fridays and the season of Lent. And I was actually going to add this on, but number 16 covers this. To fast and abstain from meat on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So you have to fast at some point. Now, there have been priests that have said that this isn't sufficient to build up a very, very effective virtue of temperance, so you can go in excess of that. But of course, consult someone who knows you well, like a spiritual director or the priest in your particular place, right? Because you can do it alone, but it might actually do you a lot of damage. There's a lot of saints, St. Ignatius of Loyola and St. John Chrysostom spring to mind, who fasted and did penance to an excess, and it seriously damaged them. Now, granted, it saved their souls probably, but still, you have to employ prudence in how much you fast. I can tell you from personal experience that if you fast too much, you may do yourself in. Okay. Number 17. To proclaim the gospel and give witness to Christian faith by our activity in the world. None of this hiding that you're a Christian. We can't do that. Because one of the things that often isn't mentioned enough, particularly in the traditional circles online, is that the first pagans to be converted, and pagans generally that were converted before Nicaea, and the legalization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine, they were converted by seeing the immense charity of the public Christians. For example, one of the famous writers about Christianity, Tertullian, who converted in the 3rd century, he was converted because he was at the gladiatorial games, and as he was a lawyer, he would know about the common criminals that were often fed to the animals in the Colosseum. And he saw the Christians being fed to the animals, and he noticed from their conduct in the arena that they were very virtuous people. They possessed charity. They were not common criminals. They were tremendously virtuous people, and of course this made him very curious, even though he was a man who at one point lived quite a licentious lifestyle. But he eventually became a very important church writer, but... Well, I'll let you read about Tertullian. Let's see. Number 18. To reject doctrines contrary to the teaching of the scriptures or those proposed as divinely revealed by the church. So this is essentially means you can't hold anything contrary to the infallible magisterium. So that would be the consensus of the church fathers, those writers of the church who were after the apostles, but generally before the schism. Some people said it to the 8th century. I've heard other people say 1054. But the consensus of those writers is considered to be infallible as well. The canons of the ecumenical councils, insofar as they were accepted by the Pope, would be another source of infallible teaching. These are things that you have to follow. There's a lot of channels that, for good or for ill, talk a lot about private revelation, things like Fatima and La Salette and Our Lady of Good Success, which is really the good success of the purification or something to that extent, right? Those things are of course important and they have their place, but they are ultimately subordinate to the infallible magisterium, which includes the scriptures, as I say, the consensus of the fathers, the canons of the particular councils, the discipline at the current moment, I suppose, would be something that you should follow, although not infallible, as I've said. Yeah. I think that's very clear. I think I'm being clear. Am I being clear? Let's see. Hans Hermann Hoppe, would the lay person in Canon 14 be a deacon? Let's check that again. To be married in the presence of a priest or a lay person designated by a bishop, by the bishop or two witnesses. I presume that it could be a deacon, although deacons are technically ordained. I'll tell you what, we'll check the canon for that, because that's actually got me curious. It's Canon 1100 and something. Let's have a look. 1108, 1112. Okay, my mistake. I'm looking a bit high. Here we go. 1000. Yeah, you see, I'm clicking the wrong things, because sometimes on the Vatican page it doesn't have them as clear as they could be. Formal celebration of marriage. Here we are. Oh, here we go. So this is the specific canon 1108 on this. Only those marriages are valid which are contracted before the local ordinary, pastor, or a priest or deacon delegated by either of them, who assist before two witnesses according to the rules expressed in the following canons without prejudice to the exceptions mentioned in Canon 144, 1112, 1116, 1027. So essentially, let's see what these consist in. So the diocesan bishop can, if there's no priests or deacons, give a layperson. So I am presuming that that means that, in this case, deacons can preside at weddings. Okay, so is there any other questions that I've missed before I move on? I don't think I have. Okay, let's continue. Right. 19. To give, quote, religious submission of will, intellect and will to doctrines declared to be matters of faith and morals by the Church. So, for example, you must submit in your intellect and will to the fact that Christ was crucified. This is a fact, and you must believe it. So, you can't, for example, there's no such thing as a blind faith, because will is determined by intellect, right? You can't just will something without knowing it. But you can know something and not will it. So, for example, there are many people out there who know for a fact that Christ was crucified and rose again on the third day, but they're not Christians. That would be an example of that, as opposed to the will does not precede the intellect. You can't will something you don't know. So you need the intellect there first. At least I think that's what Aquinas. I think Aquinas taught that, but there are other people who teach different things, but they're in different senses. Number 20, to adhere with a, quote, religious submission of mind to the authentic teachings of the bishops. So obey your bishops. There's a lot of disobedience of bishops. This is not your prerogative to do unless they're doing something that is very clearly egregious. Because the church is supposed to be in unity. I think it's Psalm 132. It's blessed when the brethren are all in unity, to some extent. And just because you have some particular quibble with the local bishop, say for example, I don't know. Say he's got some, like, I don't know, maybe he votes for the Democrats or something, but he knows the fact that abortion is horrendously evil, or something like that. He may well have other reasons for that. That might be good ones, right? But, you can't possibly know that. He's the representative of Christ. That doesn't mean you should vote with him, necessarily. But you respect him. Okay, let's see. To observe other decrees which Christian authorities issue to define doctrine or erroneous opinions. To observe other doctrines which church authorities issue to define doctrine or erroneous opinions. Okay, I'm just a bit confused by that one. Let's see the canon. The canon is 754. Okay. That's actually 45. Whoopsie daisy. All the Christian faithful are obliged to observe the constitutions and decrees which the legitimate authority of the Church issues in order to propose doctrine or to prescribe erroneous opinions, particularly those which the Roman Pontiff or the College of Bishops put forth. So basically, obey your bishop, obey the Pope. It's pretty simple, and you need to know what that is. So going and reading, say, the letters that, say, the Pope writes, the encyclicals, that's the ones. That would be a good example of something that would be good to do, or a duty, more clearly. Okay, to fulfill the responsibilities to one's spouse and family incurred by marriage. So, I think these are pretty clear. To be able to obey your husband and to be willing to die for your wife. That's what St. Paul makes pretty clear, but I'll read the canon as well, because there's a specific canon on this. This is 1134. So, and there we go. From a valid marriage there arises between the spouses a bond, which by its nature is perpetual and exclusive, so no sleeping around. Moreover, a special sacrament strengthens and, as it were, consecrates the spouses in a Christian marriage for the duties and dignity of their state. Each spouse has an equal duty and right to those things which belong to the partnership of conjugal life. So, there's nothing wrong with sex, and each partner has an equal right to it. Parents have the most grave duty and the primary right to take care as best they can for the physical, social, cultural, moral, and religious education of their offspring. The children conceived or born of a valid and putative marriage are legitimate. The father is he whom a lawful marriage indicates unless clear evidence proves the contrary. Children born at least 180 days Children born at least 180 days after the day when the marriage was celebrated, or within 300 days from the day of the dissolution of conjugal life, are presumed to be legitimate. Illegitimate children are legitimated by the subsequent valid or putative marriage of their parents, or by a rescript of the Holy See. It's interesting that the Pope's guys have to get directly involved for things like this. As regards canonical effects, legitimated children are equal in all things to legitimate ones unless the law has expressly provided otherwise. Okay. I'm not going to read that out, Felix, but if he gives you a legitimate command, you follow it. It doesn't matter if he has some strange things. David H. says, should Catholics read the King James Bible, the one written after the Protestant Reformation? No, because it's in error, and it comes from bad... I mean, King James was a very interesting figure. I'd avoid it. It was also on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, so you should avoid it. Just stick to the Douai, man. Just stick to the Douai. Okay. When exactly does it automatic excommunication happen if you commit sacrilege? No. Sacrilege doesn't automatically excommunicate you, though it is a mortal sin if you commit it consciously. Okay, let's continue. To build up the family of God through our marriage and family. You know, some of these duties are great. I like them. Some of them are hard, but some of them are really nice. Number 24, to baptize our children and raise them in the Catholic faith. Something that we all need to do more of. Number 25, to provide for the religious education of our children. Number 26, to establish, promote and maintain Catholic schools. Number 27, to promote social justice according to the Church's teaching. That doesn't mean tearing down statues. That means following, say, the encyclicals of Blessed Pope Leo XIII. To care for the needs of the poor and to support the Church financially. We need to be tithing for our churches, guys. If they're going to a good place, right? I mean, I've heard some people say, well, if that money is going to go to, find its way to an abortion charity, which would be something you'd want to avoid, you know, be sure of that, right? Make sure it doesn't end up in hands that would, say, kill babies. And that's the end of the responsibilities. Sacrilege isn't automatic excommunication, but basically all bishops have extended automatic recommunication upon confession. Oh, I didn't know that. If that's the case, then okay, but I don't know. Let's go on to rights then, because this is something that we can expect, in a certain sense. Although we may not, of course, receive that. In reality, that's what we should expect. Number 1, to be recognised as fundamentally equal with all other Christians. So we are all in the likeness and image of God. No race, no sex, no social class, none of that changes the fact that all mankind is in the likeness and image of God. And any attack on this teaching is heresy. Any belief that a woman is inferior to a man, in terms of nature, is heresy. Any belief that people are inferior on the basis of their race is again heresy. And so on and so forth. To be human is to be in the likeness and image of God. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily a good person. In fact, all of you have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But that doesn't make us not equal in terms of charity. Although to be in the friendship of God is something entirely different. 2. To be free from being forced to embrace the Catholic faith against our conscience. So in other words, you can't force a baptism on someone, I suppose that's what that means. 3. To cooperate in building up the body of Christ and spreading the gospel. So you can help preachers and stuff like that. Number 4. To make our spiritual needs known to our pastors. They are there to look after the community, and that includes you. Number 5. To express our opinion to church authorities concerning what is good for the church. St. Catherine of Siena even went as far as writing letters to the Pope. That would be an example of that. Number 6. To choose our vocation or state in life. You can't be forced to get married, and you can't be forced to become a monk. This was even a thing in the 13th century, because St. Thomas Aquinas, his family wanted him to become a Benedictine so he could become abbot of Monte Cassino, and from there exercise influence for the Aquino family. I think they were called the Aquino family. But Thomas, of course, refused. And so his parents eventually locked him into a tower for 3 years. And that was where he learned Holy Scripture very well. And failing this, his brothers proposed trying to have poor Thomas seduced by a prostitute, and therefore led into a to induce him to mortal sin and to, trap him that way. Now, the famous story goes that Aquinas drove this prostitute out with a burning hot iron from the fire, and eventually his family consented to his right to choose his vocation, which was to be a Dominican. Let's continue. Number 7, to worship according to our own right and to follow our own form of spirituality. Now, of course, as long as this doesn't conflict in error, so in other words, there's no error in, for example, disliking the spiritual teachings of the Desert Fathers. I've found that while they've been useful, I know now from personal experience that I'm not suited to that kind of life. It's too hard. And I'm far too... I like people too much to be a hermit. So you don't have to do that. But likewise, if you are suited to being a hermit, you can't, say, force the Benedictine way of life on that particular person. Likewise, if you want to... say, I don't know, chant the office, no one has the right to force, say, Ignatian spirituality on you. Which, of course, makes perfect sense. Number 8, to hear the word of God and receive the sacraments. So you are by canon law allowed to receive the sacraments, assumingly no matter what, unless prudence prohibits that. I'd have to check the canons precisely, because that might cause some problems for some of the situations that have been going on very recently. Although you could say that's a matter of prudence. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a canon lawyer. I'm not even gonna go on down that route. Number 9, to receive Holy Communion if we have sufficient understanding and not forbidden to do so by church law. Pretty clear. Number 10, to have our confession heard by a priest who is suitably prepared. Again, receiving the sacraments. Number 11, to confess to a priest of our own choice. So we can't be forced under compulsion to confess our sins. I'm presuming this is a discipline and not a doctrine. Because a lot of the time... You know what, never mind, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter to this. Number 12, to be granted absolution without delay if there is no doubt about the sincerity of our confession. Yeah, so priests can't just arbitrarily withhold your absolution if you are legitimately sorry. There are 4 levels of contrition. There is complete lack of contrition, which is number 4, of course. You have insincere contrition, which is being sorry for some trifling reason. There's imperfect contrition, which is where you're sorry, like you're legitimately sorry, but for a reason that is not God alone, or it's a mingling of reasons. And then there's perfect contrition, which is sorry for the sake of God alone. And the last two are the ones that you need to have a valid confession heard. Yeah, I suppose I should make clear that the second category that I mentioned, there's of course a very high level of insincerity, like going to confession just for the sake of looking good socially. That would be an example of that. St. Alphonsus Liguori gives a much better and more detailed definition than what I've just provided you there. Let's see. Where was I? Number 13. To have our confession treated in absolute confidentiality. To be protected from having information we confess revealed in any way for any reason. In fact, this actually laicizes the priest, if I remember correctly, breaking the seal of confession. And they may even be excommunicated. Number 14. To marry, unless prohibited by law from doing so. Pretty clear. To be supported by the church in preserving and strengthening our marriage. So the church can help you out. You can go to the church and say, look, we're having problems, can you help us out here? Number 16. To marry a non-Catholic with the permission of the bishop under the procedures established by church law. Mixed marriages, I think it was in the book of Ezra. I think the priest Ezra arbitrarily forced everyone to break their marriages to the Gentiles in Israel when he came back from Babylon. But it didn't go particularly well, and I think that comes from this. Where was I? Number 17. To be separated from a spouse who creates grave danger of soul or body to oneself or our children, or who otherwise makes common life difficult. So, for example, if you're married to an alcoholic, and he's violent, or she's violent, or she's trying to get you to, mortally sin with her. Maybe particularly in our day and age, maybe one who has obscene tastes in a carnal manner. That would be a reason to run a mile. Yeah. I'm not sure how far it would mean who or otherwise makes common life difficult. I'm not sure how that would be defined, but they're often very lenient with annulments nowadays. And frankly, some people say that's because the church leadership is lax, and I don't have any position to judge that. But I do think that a very large chunk of people contract marriages without properly thinking them through. So, it goes both ways. And that may make it necessary for there to be an annulment. Number 18. To receive a church funeral and be burned in a church cemetery, unless we are judged to be notorious apostates, heretics, schismatics, or a sinner whose burial in the church would cause public scandal. So, Antiochus Epiphanes would not receive a church funeral. Did I read burned? Buried. Burning's actually a bad thing. You shouldn't burn your body, because that implicitly says that you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. I was kind of taken aback. I said burn, but I misread that. My apologies. Let's see if there are any questions in the chat. Have I read the Quran? No. You can only be validly sacramentally married to someone who is validly baptized, if I recall correctly. A Catholic could potentially marry an Orthodox or Lutheran, but not a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, or a Muslim. I have no idea. I think that's more of a bishop's concern than ours. Here we go. Where was I? To be cremated, unless done for reasons contrary to Christian teaching. Never mind. To have Christian teaching explained in a manner that is suited to our condition in life and the circumstances of the times. So basically, we're owed teachers. But we have to produce those teachers ourselves in some sense. Number 21. I've gone for a couple without numbering them. To associate with others and to hold meetings for charitable reasons for reasons related to our vocation in life. So yeah, we're allowed to have meetings at church. Pretty clear. Number 22. To engage in apostolic action according to our state in life and appropriate preparation. So I presume that means that we're allowed to carry out the acts of mercy and to preach and such things. Maybe not preaching, but yeah. Yeah, okay. Number 23. To receive a Christian education, study theology, and research theological issues. So we're allowed to read the documents of the church, basically, insofar as they're public. And for our state in life, right? There's no sense providing a child with a Summa. Number 24. Well, I mean, unless that child is really smart. Number 24. To choose the means which can best promote the education of our children and to seek the assistance of civil society in the education of our children. So, I presume that refers to use of state schools. But I mean, the thing is that at least before Vatican II, I have an examination of conscience from the 1930s, and they outright say that sending your child to a state school or a non-Catholic school can be under some circumstances a mortal sin. So I don't know about now, but you might want to consider not sending. I mean, I don't think I've got the kind of audience that is particularly keen on sending their children to state schools anyway, unless they're very sure. I think there's more of a homeschooling kind of trend in my audience, but I don't know. I think it's certainly changed since the 30s, though. But don't quote me on that. To have our good name and reputation protected. Yeah. Number 26. To have our privacy respected. Yes. 27. To be protected from unnecessary or unfair penalties and the arbitrary imposition of penalties not specifically required by church law. So, I presume that means that the parish council can't impose something ridiculous on you. Number 28. To be protected from penalties imposed for violations resulting from ignorance or misunderstanding and from penalties imposed without warning. So I presume if you perhaps act out of accordance with the Mass by accident because you've never been to that particular Mass before, you can't really be punished for it because you don't know. So if you go to TLM for the first time and you start giving the responses in English for whatever reason, maybe you're like a little kid or something. I'm just coming up with examples on the fly here. They don't have to be ones that make sense, but they illustrate the point. Number 29. To vindicate our rights in a church court when they have been violated. Number 30. To hold certain offices in the church for which we are qualified. So, in other words, you can't have women priests. Number 31. To receive a just wage if we are employed by the church. Pretty clear. Number 32, and finally, to exercise the rights guaranteed to us as citizens by civil law. So, I mean, aside from things like, I don't know, like something obscene like the right to abortion, if they could, that sort of thing couldn't even be provided. But yeah, insofar as their moral, the rights can be followed, you can have say Second Amendment rights in the states, and I presume that means. Okay, so we're going to enter the question time now. As always, I will be checking the riots. I haven't seen anything as of yet. If you could share the stream with people who want to have questions answered while I go and sort some stuff out, that would be very much appreciated. Please tag me if you have questions. I will indeed be scrolling back through the chat to pick up any I've missed. So I will be 2 seconds, guys. Give me 2 secs.
اسمه بشويسه بالخنف هو اللي له اسمه رف هنيت تشوسي اسمه رفن في انجلو سيرو اللي له اسمه رفن في زنا مسيرو اسمه رف بيرين بيو اللي له اسمه رفن سيوتيرو انت بيو نفئو انت نفئو هللويا لمنيكي مو الصيف شوي نفئو
مارو اسمو تيرو افراني مبشوي سللويا جنسوف افغوس او افشوبي
انصف أفون هنو أصون تلل ويفتحو إراتو شاينين مشايني انت بييني
أفكو إنهون هو النفسيني هللويا اسمو ابشوي سيبول خلق قاهي
نيزرا كنمني ننتير هللويا او اكرم او الأوشيون او خريستالوس او ابن منصار سيونيت إيري ام بفصاجي
نتو اتشو سينم نيكالم فوتيرو هللويا نيشين فيوطا نمنيشن سبتيرو
نيسيريون نمني تبنو ويتيرو هللويا نيتشطفي نمني على تيت او ينتن
ني أورو أنت بقاين ني لاوستيرو هللويا ني أرفون نمني رفتي أبتيرو أنت بقاهي
هنخل شيرين من برسين وسللويا هنخلوين هنقلوي
مارو اسمو تيرو إفراني مبشوي سللويا جابت شي سنجي بفران إما بط
بفوني بولشو بيجين بقاينم انريخنت بقللويا ابن شي سيم بطب انت بفلاوس
واسم تاني اس او ابتير طاف هللويا ننشر باسرائيل بلاوس اتخنتيروف هللويا هللويا هللويا
قوم بشوي سخن وقوم بري هللويا جي قريب فز مخنت اكليسيين تاني اسوال
عارفونو في الجيب اسرائيل ايجين بطلصاميو فهللويا ننشري انسيوم مارو سيدي ايجين بورو
مارو اسمو ابفرانيس اوال.
And I am back. For those who are curious about the music, because I've noticed that some of you guys in the chat are very curious, it is actually in Coptic. It is the fourth Tasbeha of the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is a collection of 3 psalms. I believe it's Psalm 147, 148, and 149, or it's 148, 149, and 150. I can't remember which one. But it's not in Aramaic, it's not in Arabic, it's in Coptic. So you guys were close, but not quite close enough. So we're gonna look for questions in the chat. I'm gonna check over very quickly at the Nothing on the Right server. So let's have a look here. Let's see the ones I haven't already answered. So, what was our Lord's blood type? I think it was something like AB negative, according to the Eucharistic miracles and the Turin Shroud. It's AB negative or something. Yeah, so people in the chat answered it was AB. It's something like AB negative. It's entirely important to worship, but it's an interesting consistency in Eucharistic miracles that they would provide the same blood type. Whole day mean 24 hours before Mass or midnight until Mass? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Ask him where it says it's a sin to be celibate if you're not in the religious order. You have to be celibate unless you're married. In which case, yeah. Let's see. Catholics, should they read King James Bible? No, they shouldn't. No, stick to the Douai and stick to the books that haven't been on the index of forbidden books. I know Catechism of Pius X advises Catholics only read Catholic Bibles, try the Knox or Douai. Well, you shouldn't be reading... I mean, if you've got a Catholic Bible, it'll have the whole canon. If you have a Protestant Bible, it's going to miss out a bunch of books. They'll sometimes include them as Apocrypha. For example, my housemate has the King James Bible with the Apocrypha, which is our Deuterocanon. So, even so, I mean, the King James Bible isn't a particularly good translation anyway, from an accuracy point of view, so avoid anyway. Do you agree that churches should get tax breaks and funding from the government, or it's the responsibility of the community to support the church? Well, it's both. The government is part of the community, so they should be funding the church. Let's see. Oh, fortitude equals actions free from fragility. That's not necessarily true. It's the ability to take punishment. Temperance, action free from passion. No, temperance is moderation of the passions. So, being moderate in how you eat, that would be temperance. So starving yourself or overeating is intemperate. Justice is action free from irrational self-interest. No, justice is, well, basically directing your action based on what is just. So no, I don't agree. Thoughts on the Unification Church? Never heard of it. Leave it and go to the Roman Catholic Church, because that is the true church. So what happens to people that are cremated on Judgment Day? Well, God does overpower. I mean, God has infinite power. Of course, He can give you your body back on Judgment Day. It just shows that you don't have particular faith in the resurrection of the body. They did burn bodies during the Great Death. I think you mean the Black Death, Isidore. And it's probably because they didn't have enough space. But God, these things to God, they don't mean anything. He can just grant you, the body again. Don't forget, it's Him that permits you to burn the bodies. He doesn't will it, though, as far as I understand. God is all-powerful, but somehow He cannot prevent the vast majority of humanity from spending an eternity suffering. No, He actively wills it because it's in accordance with His justice. If you choose your own will in this life, be that through explicitly willing evil or willing some lesser good aside from God, then God is not going to impose that you follow His active will in all things, which is what heaven is. And lesser wills are hell. For example, remember when this whole disease began? And remember how there were all of those cruise ships about, with all of the passengers stuck on board because they went on a pleasure cruise and they decided that they were going to indulge their various passions. And how they were stuck in harbour often for weeks on end. And they had to have supplies brought in by helicopters. That, in a certain sense, is a prefigurement of hell. Because they didn't have to be on that pleasure liner. And they likely chose so for the sake of their passions. And because their passion led somewhere that was unanticipated, which is often where, say, the pursuit of lust leads, they ended in a sort of hell because they were trapped inside of the passion. And so it's entirely in order with God's justice that He's not going to force His will on us, because He loves our will, because our will is the means by which we love Him. You can't force someone to love you. Is it really a good marriage if you have to threaten your wife into loving you? And likewise with God, is it really true love if you have to force someone's will? As opposed to that person deliberately sacrificing that will. So, it's entirely just that people go to hell. Entirely just. Public schools are honestly too anti-Catholic for you to send your kinds there nowadays. But it may have been possible 10 to 20 years ago, but not now. I don't know. Let's see the questions. Coptics, we was pharaohs. They literally were pharaohs. Because that's the Coptic language is actually the direct descendant of the Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's just written in a Greek script. It's written in a Greek script with some additional characters. Do you know / recommend any good books about celibacy? Oh, I don't know any. I mean, yeah, I don't know about that one. Generally, you'll find stuff about chastity in books, just spiritual books in general. So, The Spiritual Combat by Don Lorenzo Scapoli, or The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, or all manner of different books. I mean, Self-Abandonment isn't one that has anything specifically on chastity. But, in terms of specific books, you've completely struck me dead. I don't know, mate. Sorry. What's, in your view, from a purely object analysis, I'm going to say object as opposed to ontological, because I think that's what you mean. Purely object analysis, the solution to the supposed is-ought gap. A way to make goofy people like Sam Harris and Peterson save 6 hours every once in a while. Well, Sam Harris has a really not a very good solution to this, because he believes we can find our morality through science. Now, you can't test for morality. There aren't instruments to pick it up. And you can say test for results, but they presuppose moral values. So, for example, say we found an infallible means of making everyone richer. Now, if you had a modern morality, you would pursue that to the expense of everything else, because in economic theory, it's generally seen as morally good to make people as rich as possible, and that's how a lot of people think. But if you had a Christian worldview, an authentically Christian one, you'd probably avoid that, because you know that making people rich hardens their hearts, which leads to the destruction of virtue, as well as making them able to acquire any number of different sensual pleasures they don't need. And you can't test for that. Sam Harris, if Sam Harris thinks that we can legitimately test for that, or something, you see, I'm thinking of making a stream on cognitive science, right? Because I'm thinking for my master's thesis that I'm going to write a thesis just going after these physicalistic cognitive scientists, because they bug me to no end, because they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. You've really that really ticks me off. I'm thinking of doing a stream specifically on the philosophy of mind, because you have all these people who think that, you know, the soul is just manifest in the brain as if it's some sort of physical thing. Well, it's okay then, smarty pants. Then how come your brain cannot be, your thoughts cannot be divided in two, right? How come you can't throw your thought of, say, a triangle across the room? Why is it not influenced by physical laws then, smarty? Okay, so if your brain is some sort of physical mass, then when you come to know a particular thing in reality that's actual, like this book that I have in my hand, for example, then how come you can't fit that in your brain? Why is it that you can't fit the book in your brain? And I'll tell you precisely why. It's because your brain is immaterial, and it conceives of the potentiality of the particular object, which is immaterial in itself. And that is something that's not going to make sense to many of you who haven't read St. Thomas Aquinas, but I'm going to do a stream on this because it needs to be said. This is one of the things that legit bugs me. But basically, the is-ought gap, there isn't one, because oughts are ises. And if you disobey the oughts, then you're going to suffer the consequences. That's what natural law is. And yes, I was whacking the book over my head. Because this is something that bugs me. Felix the Monarchist asked, I have heard that presuming that someone is in heaven or hell unless they are saints is a sin. But I wasn't able to find something like this is an actual sin. I wouldn't do it. I mean, the only person who can judge is God. So you're usurping his authority. So I suppose in a certain sense it would be a sin, yes. But I don't know where it sits in terms of catechism. I know I try to refrain from doing it, but I've heard a lot of other people in respectable places do that. So, I mean, you can say something along the lines of, well, what we can tell from their life tends towards a particular direction, but that doesn't by any means guarantee they're anywhere. Okay, so Hans Hermann Hoppe says, Alistair McIntyre talks about this is-ought gap. It doesn't exist, yeah. The After Virtue book. Funding churches by the government is what happened in Germany. Okay. That doesn't mean that they have to be subservient to the government. The King James Bible is excellent ammunition for a trebuchet. Okay. Let's see. Hell is not punishment from God, rather a natural course of things if one does not receive God's grace. Yeah, because God's grace is required to go to heaven. You entirely damn yourself to hell through the rejection of God's grace, but God entirely saves you through providing you His grace. You don't save yourself. What are good books about the history of the French and Russian Revolution that were not written as pro-Enlightenment or anti-God propaganda? Oh. Okay, so for the Russian Revolution, this isn't directly about the Russian Revolution, but I found... Granted, I've only listened through part of the abridged version. I found the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn to be a good one. Very depressing, but also kind of darkly funny. For the French Revolution, you'd probably want something like the Reflections on France by Edmund Burke, even though Burke was a Protestant. You might want to look into Joseph de Maistre, who that was Considerations on France, I think that one was called, but I've never read him. But I know that he's written some good stuff. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was not very popular in the West. That's often something that Jordan B. Peterson won't mention, because he was not a liberal. Yeah, Sam Harris is Sam Harris is someone to be ignored. He's kind of like he reminds me a bit of Elon Musk when Elon Musk talks about AI. When Elon Musk and people who work for Tesla and that sort of those public intellectuals involved with computing in any sense talk about computers, it makes me cringe. It makes me cringe really badly. And the thing that bugs me the most is that I've seen a lot of people who should know better sort of echo those statements. And like for example, these people backing a cashless society. I mean, you saw half of the internet go down a week ago or so because of Cloudflare being taken out for an hour. And you think that you're somehow going to run a cashless society with so many vulnerabilities, let alone something like a power cut? Imagine that. You have a power cut in a city for whatever reason and no one's able to buy food. And then the fridges are going too. But, we got rid of paper cash and we got rid of any other means of exchange, so I guess we're just going to have to starve to death. Like this cashless society is just... Oh, I should make a stream on just grievances I have with the tech industry, because there's so many I have. It bugs me to no end. It really, really bugs me. According to statistical physicists, they do actually think that the brain gets heavier when you learn something. Oh, Boltzmann. Oh, so like Boltzmann machines. Yeah, that's... Boltzmann machines are... I think they're linear... Are they linear? They're instant-space learning tools, aren't they? I never learnt Boltzmann machines for my undergrad, but I might look into them for my post. In terms of our brains getting heavier when we learn, that might be a result of the interconnection of neurons, which does actually play a part in memory. However, the actual intellection and willing of those neurons is something that is decidedly immaterial, as Aquinas talks about in Prima Pars, question 75. I believe it's... I don't think I can't remember the one he speaks about... the one where he speaks specifically about memory. I don't know. Dionama has a book on that. I think that's one of the books in Dionama talks about that. But if you want to have a look into, say, St. Thomas Aquinas' theory on mind, you'd want to look into Prima Pars, questions 75 through 102, because that covers the soul, the body, the union of soul and body, and stuff related to man in a very basic sense. If you wanted to look into things like virtue, you'd want to look at the Secunda Secundae Partis of the Summa. And I'm telling you, it is very hefty reading. It took me about an hour and a half to get through 2 articles of question 75. It's very hefty reading. But yeah, I was saying this to a priest the other day, right? Theoretical physics has replaced metaphysics, but the trouble is that theoretical physics doesn't work because a purely physicalistic worldview makes no sense. let's continue with these questions. What exactly is the problem with the King James Bible? They're missing... Well, first of all, it's based on Masoretic manuscripts, which are known for having errors in them. St. Alphonsus Liguori recommends against them explicitly in his commentary on the Psalms. That's for the Old Testament. Also, it's missing a bunch of books, and it's translated by a king who was a little bit too involved in demonology for his own good. Avoid. How major are the translation errors? Like the Masoretic text omitting certain prophecies that are present in the Greek translations of the New Testament. Bad. Let's see. Do you have book recommendations on the historic conversion of the pagans in Europe in the same time as people like St. Bonaventure, St. Leopold of Austria, and Charlemagne? Vita Caroli Magni by... Is it Nennius? No, it's Einhard. That's the one book that I have any idea about. Well, actually, that's a lie. You could go and read the Ecclesiastical History of the English People by St. Bede the Venerable. That's very good. Insofar as I've read it. You could read... Bede the Venerable. St. Bede the Venerable wrote a lot about the conversions of the pagans in England and the stories of the various saints who were present in England around that time. So I don't think it's explicitly mentioned in St. Cuthbert, but St. Cuthbert's one of the writings, St. Wilfrid. There's another one on the story of St. Oswald, who I don't think that was written by St. Bede though. As for Germany, the only one I can tell you about is Einhard, Vita Caroli Magni, or the Life of Charlemagne. That's the only one that springs to mind. As a tech worker, I couldn't agree more. Look, I should do a stream because there's so many things about the tech industry that bugs me so badly. Like, I had this argument with a guy today on a Facebook page I'm on, or Facebook group, where he insisted that we should just abolish the high streets and the shops, because apparently everything's moving online and that's where the Zoomers are ordering everything anyway. And I legit, he wouldn't get it, right? I don't know if he was willfully not getting it or what, but he didn't seem to see that the sorts of logistics that are required in transporting things via Amazon and via the gigantic infrastructure required to support the e-economy is so, well, e-commerce generally is so fragile that it would be absolutely insane to go to an e-commerce model only, because you kick out one thing out from under it. Say for example, like I said, like a power outage, right? You have a power cut, or say an ISP goes down. You know that one well-placed nuke could probably take out half of the internet for the entire world for weeks, because you just nuke a particular part of the Cloudflare infrastructure and it would be gone. It's ridiculous. Like these pie in the sky, these people that just hold this pie in the sky flowery view of technology. They like, if they actually follow this, they are gonna end up in a fresh kind of hell that our ancestors, even our ancestors when they had famines, wouldn't be able to imagine, because at least they had some food. If you're entirely reliant on a just-in-time logistical strategy made even more impractical through the use of internet alone, then it's just asking for trouble. I mean, like, as somebody who is involved in tech, I should be behind it because it benefits me monetarily, but the thing is that it can't benefit me monetarily if the system collapses because a power outage takes out a city, right? Like, you've all seen what happened with Hurricane Katrina, right? Now imagine that in a regular city because there's a solar flare or something, because that's what we're talking about. If you had an entirely e-commerce based, driverless cars based economy, and there was a solar flare on the level that caused, say, power cuts, I think it was in Toronto in the 90s or something, you aren't just talking about, I can't switch on the telly, I have to get a new one. You're talking about the entire infrastructure of a major city being taken out. and things are going to get nasty because everything was electrical based. You won't be able to have people buying things. The shops won't necessarily get restocked in very short order because all of the logistic hubs in any sort of like close area, all of the cars won't be able to work because even if they have drivers, they rely on, say, electrical steering systems and braking systems. What else? You won't be able to drive the wheelchairs around if you've got an electrical wheelchair. That's a pretty small example. I mean, this technologizing of society is ridiculous. Particularly that people, like, I mean, this cashless... Oh, man, I'll save this rant for another stream, I think. Insert reference asks, thoughts on bringing about your full potential in terms of performance competence to create wealth for yourselves and then use it to help others? Or is self-maximization inherently vainglorious? I mean, there's nothing wrong with making money if you intend to use it for something good. Just be careful that it can corrupt you. Thoughts on worker-owned co-ops? I think that business leaders should be forced to invest in their workers. Oh, yeah, Hans Hermann Hoppe, right? There were these people disagreeing with this guy, and he was telling them to learn to code, and I shouldn't say anything, but like, I'm sorry, the guy. Could you talk more about how we could choose a job / college major? General advice for people in college and looking for careers. Pick something that people will want to buy. Don't follow your passion, right? Like they told us in university, oh, follow your passion, and they showed us this video of this guy who did some sort of science subject and then discovered that he wanted to be an author after he finished his degree or something. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, right? I like writing. I prefer reading history and reading theology to reading, say, machine learning. But the thing is that there are already tons of historians, and I'm not going to make a huge income by, teaching theology. That's for the church to do. That's not for me to do. So what I did is I picked something that was high in demand, that I was able to do. I could stomach it, right? And I mean, to be honest, I mean some of the say like Agile, or some of the manufacturing processes for software engineering would knacker me. But I can tolerate data science. I quite like it. So, I picked something that was useful. Don't go to university for the sake of something that isn't going to be useful. If you want to be a priest, of course, go to university. Do a bachelor's in philosophy. I don't know why you want to do that, but hey ho. You might need it for a seminary or something. Then go to seminary and do that. That's fine. You don't have to do it for the sake of money, but at least do it for something that you're going to spend your time using, right? And if you're going to do humanities for the sake of it, then just don't bother, because you can go. One of the things that people should do. They should go onto the particular universities they respect and look at the reading lists and just buy the books from the reading lists and then just read them. Why would you pay thousands of US dollars or thousands of pounds to study a course simply because you're interested in it, when you could just go onto their websites for free? They sometimes even offer free lectures. Just watch the lectures and buy the books on the course and read them. It's that simple. Now, for some things like, for example, machine learning, on a more fundamental level, you have to go to university to study it. Likewise, becoming a doctor. Forms of engineering, right? That's fine. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're just learning it for interest, don't bother. Why would you put, say, $30,000 US down? Let's be conservative and say $30,000 US. Why would you put that amount of money down in living expenses, tuition, etc., for the sake of studying something that you're just interested in? Silly. Just buy the books. You might spend a couple of $1,000 on the books. Go on Abe Books, right? I'm actually one thing I'm going to mention here, but I'll probably announce later. I have 5 crates worth of books. A lot of them theological, a lot of them historical, a lot of them philosophical, and even a few language ones. I'm thinking of selling some of them. And I'll announce this formally on a stream, but I know that a lot of you guys would be interested in having a pretty good source of books. So I might make this a bigger thing, because I know what to look for. I might just resell them to you guys if you're interested. Forced to invest in their workers. Can you expand on that? Well, I was listening to Charles Colombe and I think it's Vincent Franchini on Tumble House today, and they made it very clear, and I agree with them because they explained it pretty well, that the main problem with capitalism is that people, you have to invest a 9 to 5 into an office job, say 40 hours a week for a middle class job. Now, but does the employer have to invest anything equal in you? No, they can just dismiss you at any moment. They pay you and that's it. When in previous times, what they would do is they'd ask a lot less of you, and then they'd do things like host feasts, like the what were they? The serfs on the Lord's land. And I mean, you see some of these corporations do cushy things like that, but the trouble is that it's cloaked in this secular pseudo virtue, and it seems very fake from the outside, whereas it was very genuine in the majority of cases on the Lord's land, because people were a lot more religious back then. They weren't continually trying to force in this false sense of charity. It was genuine. And so that's what I mean by invest in their workers. They need to actually care about the people involved. And of course, I'm not saying that this is like a blanket rule. Of course it isn't. But it just seems to be a general trend that, say, the lowest of the low workers, say data entry people or cashiers and such. No shame in that job, by the way. They're not treated very well by the higher management, and higher management doesn't care about them. Thoughts on basically ethnic replacement. Well, that's one of the streams that I could potentially do. It's on the poll. It's on the poll for the next show on the communities tab. In short, I have no problem myself with marrying somebody of another ethnicity. In fact, I've never ever dated anyone who is of my own ethnicity. So, I'm not gonna. I don't think there's anything inherently morally wrong with that at all. A history major is useful if you want to study law as a graduate, because yeah. You see, if you have a legitimate reason, then do it. Joan of Arc. I have 4 Roman Catholic kids, ages 21 to 11. I need this church and country to be fixed real fast. Get on it, boys. There you go. There you go, guys. There could be you as well, Have a family. There's no reason to let the secular culture depress you. Don't forget, the apostles went into a world that was surprisingly similar to our own. They had the religious cults, they had the apathy, they had a cynical elite, and they had a lot of violence about. There were the majority of people didn't really control their emotions, and the intellectual elite was very arrogant. And granted, they had more reason to be arrogant than the modern people do, but not. I mean, it's still a horrible thing. And they still managed to convert the entire Roman Empire. Why can't we? We just have to love them, because that's what the apostles did. They acted as Christ, as God. God loves us and loves all of mankind. And we're in a special position to have a friendship with that God and to walk with him. And that's what converted the pagans, because they saw that we walked with our God and we loved him as he loved us. And they saw the world around them. They saw the misery of the huge apartment buildings that were in fact in Rome. They saw the cheapness of human life in the gladiatorial games and the piles of dead babies. That's one thing they used to do. They used to have a particular place where they dump the babies that are unwanted. Sometimes they'd even just dump them in the forest to die. Sometimes they'd dump them within cities in organised places. They saw the inhumanity of their own civilization, and yet they saw the humanity of this little new religion that had come about, and the true love that they harboured for their brothers and sisters, and for their God. And although there were many strange rumours, say, like Celsus said that, I think it was Celsus anyway, who said, they eat the literal flesh and blood, they're cannibals, right? Although there was those rumours, which we know of course weren't true, people still flocked anyway. People converted. In fact, a lot of the martyrdoms came out of the fact that they were converting the people with such ferocity that it was draining the money from the pagan temples. Saint Apollinaris is an example of this. First Bishop of Ravenna. So, take heart, guys. We can do this. We only have to love harder than everyone else. And the only person that can provide that love is God. So don't worry. Don't worry. It's very easy to worry. It's very easy to look out into the world with its mass divorces, with the statues that are being toppled, with the mass murder of children, the degeneration of the schools, and the widespread misery which, for some reason, some people try to tell me that people aren't really that miserable, but honestly, maybe it's because I'm so happy myself that I can't ignore it. And I do say happy. Obviously, like, I don't mean I'm happy all the time, like ecstatic, but I have a certain way of life that definitely satisfies me more than other people, right? And we're surrounded by this, and we let it sometimes cool our charity because we think, oh, the world is so fallen, it's so horrible, and it makes us despair. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't. There's no need to. We can live a better life than them. And we can provide that life to them. We just have to have faith. And we have to keep following that cross. We have so many intellectual reasons to do so, right? There are just tons of sources on the early Christians. We have the entire Apostolic Fathers. We have the entire New Testament. We have the Jewish reactions in the Talmud. We have the pagan reactions from Suetonius, Tacitus. I think Sallust. Does Sallust mention them? I don't think Sallust does. You have the reactions even from the enemies amongst the pagans. Porphyry. You have these people who were relentlessly responded to, utterly debunked by just huge numbers of Christian commentators. Right. It got to a point where the secular world in the modern age was so lacked arguments so badly they had to resurrect arguments from 3rd century pagan critiques. Right, so Porphyry, for example, he provided a criticism of the Book of Daniel, and he said, well, the Book of Daniel is just so accurate in its prophecies. It must have been written in the midst of the Maccabean War, and that was the war put in the book of Maccabees in the 2nd century BC. And he says, no, this was actually written in the midst of this war. And he got 30 responses from Christians. And I'll give you a couple of debunking points now, because this is one of the most powerful arguments to actually undermine Christianity. Now, there's two things that you have to acknowledge. The first one is a really obvious one. I don't know if any of the classical writers wrote this, but there are huge responses. St. Jerome's known for making a response. Another person, Apollinaris, made a response. St. Augustine made a response in his City of God. Eusebius of Caesarea makes a response. There's 30 or so responses from the fathers to Porphyry. But two that spring to my mind that I don't know if they mentioned, they might have. We have the books of Maccabees, and in the first book of Maccabees, which is verified to be around the time of the Maccabees, Mattathias points to the prophecies of Daniel. Now, why would the writer of a history of the Maccabees appeal to a book that had only just been written? What benefit would there be to appealing to a legitimate prophecy in another book of inspired scripture if there wasn't prior precedent for that book? That's enough of a logical reason in itself, but there's a scientific reason as well. Because we actually have some of the manuscripts of the Book of Daniel, and bear in mind, I don't know if they're referring specifically to the Hebrew version or to the Greek version, but it doesn't really matter, because they're basically they're from the same tradition basically, as far as I understand. And I'll refer to specifically the Hebrew version, the Aramaic version, because you'd expect it to be a lot different than it actually is. Now you see, one of the interesting things that linguists, I don't know if they're specifically linguists or analysts of the book of Daniel, found is that there are loads and loads of words in Persian. There's entire chapters in Aramaic, if I remember correctly. There's chapters. The most of the book is written in Hebrew, but there are only 5 words in Greek, and I think something like 4 of them refer to musical instruments or something like that. Now, the Maccabean War, which took place in the 160s BC, Israel had been controlled by Greek leaders for 160 years. Alexander the Great came in and conquered the place in the 320s BC. So it had been under the control of a Greek military dictatorship of both Ptolemies and Seleucids for 160 years. And these people controlled... They first of all, there was gigantic influence on them from the Hellenized Greeks, the Hellenized Jews even. In fact, the reason why Jews are so stringent on circumcision, because originally it was a lot less was taken off. What was happening is that the Hebrew people who were taking part in the various athletic games that the Greeks introduced into the culture, they were dragging down what was left to hide the fact that they were Hebrews. That just goes to show you how much of an influence the Greeks were having on the culture of the Hebrews. So it would seem very strange that someone like Porphyry would accuse the Book of Daniel, and indeed, I think Edward Gibbon, a bunch of deists anyway, copied the same argument. And yet, not only does it not make much sense that historical books, which both the Jews don't concede that the Maccabees books are divinely inspired, but they believe that they're historical. And likewise, the Christians who do believe that they're divinely inspired, because they are, it doesn't make so much sense that the Holy Spirit would cite a prophecy that... It wouldn't make sense for the author that was writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to be referring to a prophecy that was written at the same time as the rebellion had happened. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. Likewise, you'd think that maybe the writer who was writing the prophecy after 160 years of Greek domination might be using a few more Greek terms, considering how much trade was going on between the Didache, the Diadochi even, or whatever, however they're pronounced, the Greek generals that ruled over them. You'd think that they'd be using more Greek terms, maybe terms used in trade or something like that, considering you have these gigantic Greek empires. It just doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make logical sense that this would be the case. Wow, I went on for a while. That's a bit of a rant. How many Roman Catholics are there in the UK? At least 20, right? They're actually the largest religion. Roman Catholicism is the largest religion. Let's see. It was probably in the Lord's best interest to make sure the peasants were happy, to be honest. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't love them. I have to sell the books. I don't have room. Tolerance towards outbreeding is connected to having calcified amygdala. Well, I'm not outbreeding if they're Catholic, am I? If usury is a sin, when is it sinful action or sinful cooperation to work in the financial sector? Well, when you're cooperating with usury, I presume, in an explicit way. Man, I hope I didn't bore people by going on about the criticisms of Christianity like that. Yeah, but Porphyry was a particularly vicious and quite nasty critic of Christianity, and so his works were burned by Theodosius II. Do you think people like Aristotle and Socrates could be saved? Dante seems to think so. You see, there is something called baptism of desire, which is where people desire baptism but they haven't received it, and this includes an implicit desire where they don't even know baptism exists, but they would receive it if they knew it. And that, in addition to an act of perfect charity, is sufficient for baptism of desire. Now, that extends to virtuous people who don't know that Christ exists. And it makes sense that it would be an act of charity because charity comes directly from God. So, yeah. So anyway, if there aren't any more questions, which I don't think there are, I'll check the riot very quickly. There is something here. Not anything that I can answer, so I think we'll bring it to a close. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want to vote on the next stream, you can go and do that on the communities tab for the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.